Let's start. The threats are: knight takes knight, bishop takes pawn, check, queen takes pawn, check, queen takes queen, queen takes knight. The checks are: bishop takes pawn, check, queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, knight takes knight. Let's continue. Here are the threats: bishop takes pawn, knight takes pawn, queen takes queen, queen takes bishop, rook takes pawn, rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: queen takes bishop, queen takes rook, knight takes pawn, queen to e4, a3, knight to b3, knight takes knight, check. Next puzzle. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are: rook to b6, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to b6, check, king to a3, rook takes rook, king takes rook, king to g6, f3, king to f5. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes pawn, king takes pawn. The checks are: rook to a8, check. The answer is: king to f6, rook to c1, rook to a8, check, rook to c8, rook takes rook, checkmate. Next, the threats are: rook takes pawn, check, queen takes bishop, queen takes rook, check. Here are the checks: rook takes pawn, check, queen to f3, check, queen to e4, check, queen to f1, check, queen to e1, check, queen takes rook, check. The puzzle is solved using: queen to f3, check, king to d2, queen takes pawn, check, king to c1, queen to e3, check, king to b2, queen to e2, check, king to b3, queen to c4, check. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: king takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: king takes pawn, knight to c5, king to d4, knight to b3, check, king to c3. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes rook, queen takes knight, queen takes pawn, queen takes knight, pawn takes knight, pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle: knight to f3, queen takes rook, bishop takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats: queen takes knight, queen takes pawn, rook takes knight, rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position: queen to e3, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes knight, queen takes pawn, check, king takes queen, promotes to queen, check, knight to e7. Next, threats in this position are: king takes rook, rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to b3, check. The puzzle is solved using: king takes rook, rook takes pawn, check, king to b7, rook to b6, check, king to c7. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats: pawn takes pawn, check, rook takes pawn, check, pawn takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, check, rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: pawn takes pawn, check, rook takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, rook to d6, check, king to c8. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, rook takes rook, check. Checks in this position are: knight to f6, check, rook takes rook, check. The answer is: knight to f6, check, king to g7, knight takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: rook takes pawn, bishop takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position: queen to c5, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: queen to c5, check, rook to f2, queen takes bishop. Next, threats in puzzle position are: rook takes rook, queen takes queen, check, queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to h2, check, queen to h2, check, queen to h1, check, Queen takes queen, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f2. Queen takes queen, check. Bishop takes queen. Rook takes rook. Next puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is rook takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to h1, check. Queen to g1. Another one, puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to e8, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g4, check. Queen to e2, check. g4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. g4, check. King to h4. Queen takes pawn, check. King to g3. Rook to g1, check. Next puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to f7, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn, check. King to h7. Rook to g7, check. King takes rook. Queen takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes queen. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. Knight to f1. Rook to e1. Queen to d3. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are king takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to d5, check. The answer is king takes pawn. King to d6. King takes pawn. Next, the threats are knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to h5, check. Bishop to h5, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to h5, check. Knight takes queen. Bishop takes knight, check. King to e7. Rook to f7, check. Next, threats in this position are rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are rook to g4, check. f5, check. Rook to e3, check. The puzzle is solved using f5, check. King to f4. Rook to g4, checkmate. Another puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen to b6, check. Knight to f3, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to b6, check. King to h1. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Next, threats in this position are bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Bishop takes knight. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using knight takes bishop. Bishop takes queen. Knight to e3, check. King to e2. Knight takes queen. One more, puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to f8, check. The puzzle is solved using queen takes pawn, check. King to g7. Queen takes rook. Bishop to b7. Queen to b8. Another one, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to e6, check. Bishop to g7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop to g7, check. King to g6. Bishop takes rook. Queen to f5, check. King to g2. Another one, here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are Bishop to b5, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is e5. Bishop takes pawn. Rook to e1. King to g8. Rook takes bishop. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.